All right, guys. So we're up to chapter 7, which is one of my favorite chapters because we get to talk about one of my favorite things, which are bones. And so we know that bones make up our skeletal system, but they have a little bit more in depth when it comes to bones because our bones store calcium and phosphates, and we need vitamin D and vitamin C to make these. So in this chapter, we're going to actually get a little bit more into what our bones are actually doing day to day. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so with bones, so when we're referring to bones, we think of bones as just being this hard structure that is inside of us or any animals. However, bones have two components in terms of their structure, which are compact bone, and then you have spongy bone. Now, when we think of spongy, we think of this very soft tissue, but it's termed spongy because of the way it looks. So if you take a look here, if my camera will show it, the middle of that bone that you see that's right here, that is actually what we call spongy bone, and it's only spongy because it's porous. However, this outside of this bone, which this is a real bone, don't don't judge. But we do have real bones here in the lab. But if you can hear, the outside of this bone is actually the compact bone, which is the hardest portion of it. Now, the spongy bone on the inside is still hard too. It just looks like a sponge. So we have two components of bones. So again, it's going to be harder on the outside because it's compact, which means just the cells that make up the outside of the bone are a lot more compact versus spongy, where they are a little bit more spaced out, but they're both still hard materials. Now, along with bones, we're going to have some different cartilages. If you might remember from the chicken dissection, hyaline cartilage, which had that really glassy look, is going to be on the epiphyses or the articulating portions of the bone. So the parts where the bones are going to touch other bones or rub up against things, you have to have a cartilage. So on the head of the femur, which is this bone here, you'll have where this actually attaches to our pelvis or to the acetabulum. It actually will have a hyaline cartilage on the outside. So as it rubs and moves, it actually creates a very frictionless, essentially surface, so that it allows it to glide and to move. If you imagine having two bones put together, these are very rough materials, and so it would hurt if you had these rubbing up against bone. So we need hyaline cartilage to allow for smooth movements and movements that doesn't hurt us. However, hyaline cartilage is also present in the development of fetal bones. For children who are or infants, remember their bones are very, very flexible, and that's because their bones are not hardened yet like this bone is. It's mostly cartilage and more predominantly hyaline and fibrocartilage. So their bones are cartilage, while our bones are made out of hardened material. And then we remember fibrocartilage being the little cartilages that are in between our spine or in between our vertebrae. That's going to allow for compression. So you look at this picture here, we can see that we have articular cartilage here, which would be our hyaline, which it's going to be on the epiphyses of these bones, which epiphyses just means the ends or the very top portions of the bones. So this is where these bones are going to articulate or move with other bones. But here, we also see in the middle here that we have some cartilage in between this spongy bone tissue. The reason why we have cartilage in our bones is our bones are actually made out of cartilage. So that's actually what causes our bones to grow. So the cells that make up cartilage are called chondrocytes. Chondro, that prefix meaning cartilage. So these are cartilage cells. those cells are going to proliferate, which means it's going to make more of them. That's what you're seeing right here, where you see all these cells pushing. Those cells keep dividing, which is going to make that bone grow longer and longer. So our bones are really cartilage, and once we add calcium to it, it makes it hard. But you'll get into that later on into the chapter. But just for you to understand that our bones are not just this hard material, they're actually structurally made out of cartilage. And not only are just our long bones, but we also see it in our ribs, in the epiphyses of the femur, within between our joints of our fingers. So we have cartilages everywhere, but we have hyaline and fibrocartilage, and they serve different purposes as we have talked about in the previous chapter with tissues. Um, ligaments, ligaments are going to attach or anchor bone to bone. If you've ever heard of someone getting an ACL tear, ACL stands for anterior cruciate ligament, which is located right here in the knee, behind the kneecap. So it's attaching the tibia, or excuse me, it's attaching the femur to the tibia. So ligaments are going to anchor bone to bone. Tendons, however, are going to attach muscle to bones. And those are very, very key components when it comes to the skeletal system, because by having ligaments, we're able to attach our bones to each other. And then having tendons is allowing for our muscles to attach to the bones. And of course, our muscles are what's moving our bones. It's what causes movement. So anytime I say muscle, you should think of movement. So, which this is just saying what I just said earlier, but bones serve as attachment sites for skeletal muscles and other soft tissues and some organs. And by muscles being attached to bones of the skeleton, and once they contract, when muscles contract, they are going to pull on your skeleton. So that's how you move, is by your muscles pulling on your bones. Now, like I said in the beginning of the video, bones serve a lot of different purposes. So one of the biggest one is hematopoiesis. So the prefix of hemato is referring to blood, and then poiesis is referring to making. So essentially, your bones are your blood factories. So those red blood cells and white blood cells that are floating around in your bloodstream are made from your bones. Now, on average, you make about 3 million cells, red blood cells per second. So that is a ton of red blood cells or blood that's being produced. And that is being produced on the inside of your bones, also known as the red blood marrow, which is going essentially is where it's giving its name red, because that's where a lot of your red blood cells are produced, along with your white blood cells as well. So along with that, your bones also store some things. So it's going to store two things predominantly, which is going to be calcium and phosphate. Calcium is an essential mineral for many body functions. A main one is going to be the muscle cells, which when we get into the muscle chapter, we're going to see that calcium has a big role to play in contraction. If you don't have calcium, you can't contract your muscles. Also, calcium takes a role when it comes to blood clotting. So if you get cut or scraped, you start bleeding, calcium is going to play a role in stopping that bleeding. It's also going to play a role in your nervous system. Another thing would be phosphate along with calcium. So phosphate, we know that it is essential for the synthesis of ATP, which, remember, ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which is our energy molecule. It's also prominent in making phospholipids, which are in our lipid bilayer of each cell, and the plasma membrane. So phosphate has a big role to play. So calcium and phosphate both have a big role to play in our bodies. and they're stored in our bones. So our bones are they're for structural support, but they're also for storage as well. So there's different types of bones, and they kind of categorize them as flat bones, irregular bones, long bones, short bones. So they get their name from their kind of shape. So if we look at irregular right here, yeah, we can't really say that this looks like a shape. So that's why we call it irregular. And then flat bones, which because they are flat, even though this one looks rounded, but the thickness of it is actually relatively flat. And then, of course, with long bones, they're called long bones because they are essentially longer than they are wide. And then we have short bones that are actually, of course, short. So, examples of long bones would be like our upper limbs, so our arms, our legs, um, our fingers, our digits. Those are considered long bones. Short bones, which are they're essentially their length is equal to their width. So like your bones in your wrist, which are your carpals, your tarsals, which are essentially your ankle bones. Um, and so they're very small, they're smaller shaped bones. Ergo the name short bones. Flat bones, they're named because they have flat, thin surfaces and can be slightly curved, just like our cranium or our frontal bone, as it showed us in that picture above. And so, like our shoulder blades or the scapula, those are going to be flat bones as well. And then irregular bones, they have complex shapes. And so, like our vertebrae in our back and our in the spine, our coxal bones, which we refer to as our hips, the skull, the ethmoid bones, the bones of our face, some of those are really irregular shapes. We don't have names for those shapes, so we just categorize them as being irregular. So, getting down into the structure of the actual internal bone. So there's a lot going on here, but we're going to break this down a little bit. So you should remember proximal, which proximal means that it's closer to the trunk. So this is the humerus. So this is the bone that is actually attached to your shoulder here that starts the top portion of your arm. So this is called the humerus. We also tend to call this the funny bone because it's named humerus. So we have the proximal end. And then we have the distal end. So distal means further away from the trunk. So this is the part that makes your shoulder. So if you move your arm like this very top portion that you feel moving, it smooths because it's articulating with your scapula. So this part makes your shoulder up here. So anytime it refers to the epiphyses, which is how you say this word right here, epi meaning closer to the surface. So epiphyses is going to be this portion that's at the very top of the bone or the very ends of the bones. So you have epiphyses here, and then you have epiphyses down here. This one's referred to as the distal epiphyses because it's further away from the trunk. This one is the proximal epiphyses because it's actually attaching, it's your shoulder. So it's actually a lot closer to your trunk than your elbow would be. The metaphysis, which is the place right underneath the epiphyses, which is the part that actually starts getting wider after the epiphyses. So if you look here, here's the epiphyses right here. The metaphysis is right here, which is a lot wider than the epiphyses. Usually in this region is where you're going to see a lot of bone growth in the epiphyseal line or plate. So that's one reason why it has its own special name is because there's a lot of things that happen right there. The diaphysis, which is the long portion that starts right at the metaphysis, which is the longer portion of, or the shaft of the bone, which is the longest portion of the bone, that's referred to as the diaphysis. And then, of course, once you have diaphysis, the place that starts widening up, as you can see right here, is going to be the metaphysis. You see that it's a lot wider than the diaphysis. And then at the very end, we have the epiphyses. And then you have the articulating cartilage that's down there as well. Now, If we zoom in a little bit closer, if you see that there's a line that's right here, so this would be an adult bone, but in this portion here, this is where we start seeing bone growth, but actually with the epiphyseal line, that means that bone growth has stopped. So if you see a line, it means that this is an adult and that they have reached the end of growing. But if you see a plate, which we'll see later on, which will still have cartilage in here, that means that this is still growing. So that would be more like a child. So right here, we have a line where it has fused and has stopped growing. Now with compact bone is going to be on the very outside surface of the bone versus spongy bone looks like a sponge, which is kind of porous, which is going to be on the inside of the bone. Now, we have what's called a medullary cavity, which is going to be the middle cavity. So you can think of medullary like middle. So this is the middle cavity of the bone, where we're going to have our bone marrow and more prominently yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is called yellow because it's actually fat. And if we remember from the dissection videos, fat is yellow or adipose tissue is yellow. And so therefore we have fat in the middle of our bones. Ergo the name yellow or yellow bone marrow, which over time, as we get older, our bones actually just fill up with fat. So essentially, once we get to a certain age, we're literally just bags of fat just walking around, essentially. If we get a little bit more in depth, we have what's called the endosteum. If we look at that prefix, endo means inside, and osteum is referring to the bone. So this is referring to the inside of bone, which we're looking at right here as the compact portion of the bone. And they even give us a zoom out. So it's looking at this portion right here is the endosteum, which is the inner portion of the bone. So we have some osteoclast, which osteoclast, if you think of, I always say the clast portion looks like the C looks like Pac-Man. Pac-Man always went around kind of eating. So osteoclast break down bone. Osteoblast, blast means to build. So if you see anywhere that has a blast as a suffix, blast means building. But if you have clast at the end, it means to break down. Or I think of Pac-Man like a C, like a Pac-Man going around eating. And that's what it does. Osteoclasts are going to break down bone, and then osteoblasts are going to build up bone. Now, osteoprogenitor cells are essentially stem cells, which remember can turn into any cell, but osteoprogenitor cells are going to turn into osteoblast. So essentially, they're just in a beginning stage of becoming an osteoblast. And then on the outside of bones, if you remember from the dissection video, we had the dense irregular connective tissue. So we look at this word here. Peri means around, osteum means bone. So this is the layer that's around the bone. So remember, this layer was made out of dense irregular connective tissue. By having dense irregular connective tissue around bones, it allows for things to attach to it, like our tendons, the nerves, and the blood vessels. It's going to allow that tissue, it's going to allow things to stick to it. And so if we look right here, this is actually what spongy bone looks like underneath the microscope. It does actually look like a sponge. But does that mean that it's nice and soft? No, it is actually very hard as well. It just gives the appearance of being a sponge. Now, even though that these are bones and they are hard, remember bones are still made out of cells. So cells have to have a nutritional supply. So remember, how cells are going to get their nutrition and get rid of their waste is the bloodstream. So bones, even though that they are hard, they still have to have a blood supply. So that blood supply is going to bring them glucose and oxygen, and then it's going to take away other things that the cell doesn't need and also get rid of some CO2. So your bones, even though they are hard, they still have to have blood vessels, and they also have to have nerves. Some people don't think that they have to have nerves, but if you've ever broken a bone, you can feel it. And you know that it hurts. Even if you've never broken a bone, you know that people who have, you probably will assume that it would hurt. Well, in order to be able to feel that, you'd have to have a nervous system. So we talked about yellow bone marrow. We also have something called red bone marrow. This can also be called myeloid tissue, which when we get into the blood chapter, we'll see that there's a myeloid stem cell line, which is going to produce all of our blood cells. But this is red bone marrow is where a lot of our blood cells are going to be produced, or actually are where our blood cells are going to be produced. So if you see here, the book gives a diagram of where we have blood cell production in our body. And here they give you an actual picture of bone marrow, which in the dissection video of the chicken leg, when I broke it in half, the inside of it was red bone marrow. So this is what ours looks like on the inside. This is an actual picture of it. So we have the red bone marrow, and then on the very inside, we have yellow bone marrow. So that would be fat. So if you've ever seen cartoons that show dogs or animals always wanting a bone, well, it's not because they just like bones, it's because they are actually wanting the fat out of it. Fat essentially equals flavor. So that's why dogs are always licking on bones. It's not that they like the outside of the bones, it's what's on the inside of bones. When you make like things like chicken broth or beef broth, you're actually boiling the bones, as it's also called bone broth. You're boiling the bones, which gets the fat out of it. So that's what beef broth and chicken broth is. It's just you're boiling the meat, but you're also boiling the bones, which is also getting the fat out of the bones. And that's what essentially broth is. It's just fat. So you can also get bone marrow transplants. So let's say that you have some type of leukemia, which is leukemia, essentially it's a disease or a disorder where really cancer disorder, but it's going to essentially attack your immune or your essentially your blood cells, your blood producing cells, or your blood marrow. And essentially, if you're going to get a red bone marrow transplant, you have to make sure you match it up with someone else's marrow that's going to essentially be like yours, just like a kidney transplant. You can't just take a random kidney from somebody, which um you can't just take a random kidney from someone and then put it in someone else. You have to make sure that their immune system is kind of a match, that their cells are a match, and the immune system is going to essentially be able to accept it. But essentially, when they take out bone marrow, they're essentially going to take it out and then put it into someone's vein, which then is going to go into the bones, and then that bone marrow is going to start producing those blood cells. So here it just gives us definitions of what these are. So osteoprogenitor cells, again, are stem cells that are committed to becoming an osteoblast, which means blast means to build. Um, osteoblasts are going to build a material called osteoid. It's a matrix, which essentially is it's what's going to start releasing a substance that's going to eventually harden and calcify and have salt depositions, which is going to start making the bone hard. Now, by the osteoblast releasing all this matrix, as it's releasing it, it's getting essentially trapped inside of the bone. So as it's spreading the calcium and the matrix of the bone or the osteoid of the bone, which is the substance that's going to make it hard, they're spreading all around themselves and they get trapped in it. So after osteoblasts get trapped in this osteoid, they become osteocytes or bone cells, essentially. So it's just changing a vocabulary. So when they're osteoblasts, they are building the bone, but after they get trapped in the bone, they become osteocytes at that point. Osteoclast, remember class, make the Pac-Man sign and they eat the bone. They are going to break down the bone. They're going to go through phagocytosis. They're going to actually break the bone down so that, well, actually, they're going to break it down if the body's needing calcium, if the body's low on calcium, where our bones store calcium. So in order to get the calcium out, they're going to have to essentially eat parts of the bone and then digest it, and so that it puts more calcium into our bloodstream. So in this condition here, or this disease, it's called osteitis deformans, which essentially it's a disruption between the balance of osteoclast and osteoblast. So essentially, our osteoclast and osteoblast start kind of going out of whack. Osteoclasts start breaking down bones, osteoblasts start building them back. Even though this happens normally in our body, this is an abnormal amount of that happening. So we have way too many osteoclasts breaking bones down. Then we have way too many osteoblasts building up. That can be an issue. The reason why that can be an issue is because essentially it causes excessive bone reabsorption, and then it also causes excessive osteoblast or bone deposit. So essentially, it starts making our bones look a little bit more deformed. And here you can see that it has started putting way too much bone down. Remember, our skull bone is supposed to be kind of thin. Once we have too much osteoblast activity, it's starting to put way too much bone on top of the bone. So essentially, our bones are supposed to be this thin, and then it gets this big. And so that can be an issue, and especially depends on what age you're at. If you're still growing, developing, that could be a serious issue. So this can happen in the pelvis, the skull, your back, your femur, your tibia, or essentially your legs. And sometimes this can cause your legs to start to bow out like you're bow-legged. Now, remember how we said that bones are going to secrete osteoid, or is going to start secreting that matrix around it. That matrix is called hydroxyapatite. So hydroxyapatite is composed of calcium phosphate and calcium hydroxide. Now, our bones, remember how I said our bones are made out of cartilage, and cartilage is predominantly is collagen. So collagen essentially acts as rebar, which if you've ever seen concrete being laid, it's all these little bars that are tied together that's going to give it structure. Hydroxyapatite is going to be essentially just the matrix or the salts and the hardener of our bones. However, bones, if you take away hydroxyapatite, which is what you see in this left picture over here, our bones, if they didn't have hydroxyapatite, would be the consistency of a gummy bear. And more you should know, gummy bears actually come from grounded up bones or gelatin in general. So things like Jello are made out of gelatin. Gelatin is just collagen and chondrocytes. So our bones are actually very, very flimsy. So think about if you had a bone, a gummy bear in the shape of a bone, that would be the consistency of our bones. As you can see down here, they've actually taken the hydroxyapatite out of one of them, and you can see how bendable our bones would be. But you have to think about it like this. Once you add calcium or hydroxyapatite to it, it makes it very strong. But if you take that away, it makes it very flexible. So that's where gelatin comes from. They take bones from pigs and cows after they have, taken the meat off of them. They essentially grind them up, and then they take away the calcium and hydroxyapatite from them, and that's how we get gelatin. So Jello is just grounded up bones because bones are just collagen and chondrocytes and cartilage essentially. So that's where we get gelatin from. So it's crazy to think that our bones are essentially Jello, just with some calcium added to, which is going to make them strong. So here is what our bones are going to look like a little bit more microscopically. And so essentially, they kind of remind me of trees, of how they have those rings. So these rings are called osteons, and the canal that runs inside of them is called the central canal, which is going to allow, which you can see, is going to allow our blood vessels and nerves to run through our actual bone tissue. Here we have the periosteum, which it has a fibrous layer and a cellular layer. But remember that fibrous layer is made out of dense, irregular connective tissue. It has what's called perforating fibers, which is going to act like a Velcro, which is going to make it stick to the side of the bones. And then we have external surfactential laminae, which is essentially just the rings that's going to wrap around the bone. But here we actually see how the osteocytes actually get kind of stuck and caught into the bone tissue. So remember how I said that they're releasing matrix and osteoid, and they kind of trap themselves. So they all trap themselves inside the bone tissue. The canals that they have essentially, which I call these legs, but they're essentially those canals that that are surrounding the legs are called the caniculi. So it looks like canal because it is little canals for their little legs for the osteocytes. And then lacuna is where the cell is actually sitting. So when the osteocytes are building um, the osteoids or the bone, they essentially, the pocket that they get trapped in is called the lacunae or the lacuna, however you want to pronounce it. And so the caniculi, which there are those little tunnels for its legs, it allows for nutrients and minerals and gases and waste to be transported through the cytoplasmic extensions, which is the formal way you should say that. You shouldn't say osteocyte legs, but that's what they kind of look like to me. But those are essentially cytoplasmic extensions that allow for things to pass through. And so the book gives kind of a way to think about the laminae or those rings that they're called. It actually looks like a archery target. And so the middle or the bullseye would essentially be the central canal. And then these other color rings would be like the red and the blue and the black and the white would essentially be the laminae or the rings that run around the central canal. And here is an actual picture of what that bone looks like. We like to look at these illustrations, but this is what an actual bone looks like underneath a microscope. And we see how we have a central canal, which we have our blood vessels and our nerve cells. And here are the lacunae or lacuna, excuse me. This is where those osteocytes and osteoblasts are going to be kind of stuck. So these little pockets are where essentially those osteocytes are going to remain. Chondroblast, which anytime you see blast, it means to build. Chondro is meaning cartilage. So literally, chondroblast are going to be building cartilage. And then perichondrium, peri, beginning, that prefix means around. Chondrium means, again, cartilage. So this is cartilage that's around the bone. So for cartilage growth is kind of interesting because if you go back to mitosis, so essentially here you can see that the chromosomes is going through mitosis, which in this actual phase is actually a metaphase. You see those chromosomes are lining up in the middle. And then you start seeing that in the lacunae, the chondrocytes start splitting apart. So essentially, remember mitosis that it's going to duplicate the cell and split. One cell is going to split into two cells. And this is actually how they actually grow. This is how your chondrocytes grow. They take one cell and split into two, and then those two split into two, and they just keep going and going and going. And that's essentially how they grow. And then you can see here, you see they're getting ready to split. They finally do split. And so that's how they are able to grow. So they just continue to do that over and over and over again. Also called proliferation. So with bone formation, we go through is called ossification or osteogenesis. Genesis means the beginning, just like in the Bible, it means the beginning. Or anytime you see gen means to create or genesis or the creation of. So osteo, that prefix means bone. So osteogenesis is meaning it's the beginning of bone or creating bone. So it takes a little bit to create bone. So we have what's called intramembranous ossification, which is just meaning that intra means within. So we're having ossification within the membrane. So if you look here, which kind of goes back to the last picture, we're starting to see we have osteocytes. They're going to start proliferating, and this is going to start happening with inside the bone. This is happening within a flat bone of the skull. And so the exact same thing is happening essentially in the chondrocytes. It's happening in intramembranous ossification. So essentially, the bone is going from is going from cartilage into bone. So essentially, that cartilage is getting calcified or it's getting calcium added to and hydroxyapatite, which is going to make it harder or make it a bone at that point. So that's what ossification means. Essentially, we're turning that cartilage into bones. So here, we're going to take a look at this infant here. So at the beginning, I said that infants they don't have bones, they have cartilage. This is one reason why children are able to, let's say if you did bump your child's head, it's not so big of an issue because they don't have bones yet. It's not hard. So their bones are very malleable or very flexible. It's because they're cartilage. Think about like a gummy bear. Gummy bears aren't hard. They're kind of flexible. They're kind of squishy. So are infants' bones. So we see here within 8 to 12 weeks, we have a lot of cartilage in between here. In the fetal period, which is essentially after it's getting ready to be born, we see that we have some chondrocytes in here. And we're starting to see proliferation, which proliferation means, remember, it means cell growth. And then here we start having what's called primary ossification. Remember, ossification is the building of bone. It's the hardening of bone or you're adding calcium to turn cartilage into bone. So we actually can see that right here. We see that these are chondrocytes, and then they start turning into bone. But if you notice here that the epiphyses or the metaphyses that are the mid portion between the epiphyses and the diaphyses, these portions here still have chondrocytes, which means that these are the portions that are going to continue to grow and cause the organism or the child to grow, the bones to grow longer. And so here we see that we're having some more primary ossification, but also the metaphysis is starting to get larger as well. And remember, that's the part that's going to make it start growing wider and wider. Now, as we start getting older and they start becoming more of an adolescent, we see the difference between here and here. The bone has now gotten longer, but we also are seeing that the epiphyses have has ossified, or essentially gotten calcium and hypoxy or hydroxyapatite. So if we look from here, we still see that it's cartilage here, but once they become a little bit more of a child, it's going to be a lot more ossification happening. However, we still see that this is a plate. Epiphyseal plate means that we're still seeing chondrocytes or cartilage in the metaphysis of this bone. Remember, that's going to be the part that's going to keep growing, making our bones longer. And then once we get to an adult, we see that we no longer have an epiphyseal plate. We have a epiphyseal line. So once the plate is done dividing or growing, it goes through ossification and becomes hardened and becomes a line. So if we see a plate, if we look at an X-ray and saw a plate, we know that this is a child. If we see a line where that plate has now sealed and became ossified or calcified, it is now an adult. So we look here in the adults, we don't see any more chondrocytes or any more cartilage. It is now all bone. And we also see that the medullary is more vascularized or has a lot more blood vessels on the inside of that bone. So that is the difference between children and adults. They still have chondrocytes or cartilage versus adults, we do not. So bone growth and remodeling. So this picture here shows us essentially what is happening in the metaphysis of the bone, where we are having proliferation of those cartilage. Now, each zone has a specific function. So in the first one, it's called the zone of resting. So this zone right here, this is the resting zone. There's not much happening there. They're not really doing very much. In zone 2, which is this next one that's down here, this is the zone of proliferation. Proliferation just means that we're starting to divide cells. If we're dividing cells, that means we're making more of themselves. Zone 3, these chondrocytes have stopped dividing and they start getting fatter or bigger. So those cells went from small to bigger, or as I say, fatter. And then zone 4, this is where we start seeing calcium to be deposited. So this is where we start getting, it starts adding calcium to make the bone hard. And then zone 5 is when it has finished and made the bone calcified, and now the bone has went through ossification and it has become hard. So here in this X-ray, we can still see epiphyseal plates in your ulna, your radius, the diaphysis, and in the fingers. So this would be a child's hand. So we still see that it's long bones. So remember, long bones are going to continually to grow to get longer. But once that child has reached adulthood, you'll no longer really see plates. You'll see lines, and they won't have any cartilage. It'll be completely calcified. So here, if we look at these two bones, so these are essentially remains of two individuals that had passed away. So if you look here, we can see that these lines have fused and that it's a line. But here we see that these are gaps. So that means that this one right here was a child, because we know that it's not a line yet, so it's still growing. That's why there's a big gap right here. However, in this left one here, we see that it was completely fused, which fusing just means that they have came together and become one. It has fused and become a solid bone, or one, as in one solid structure. So this one on the left here would be a adult, and this one on the right here would be a child. And so this chart gives an age range of when these bones should be fusing. So like the humerus should be between 11 and 16, and females would be 9 and 13. And then the distal radius would be between the ages of 17 and 22. So this is if you were trying to identify bones that you had found from someone who had been deceased or remains. This is how we were able to determine what their age is by looking at the epiphyseal plates and lines. So there are certain disorders, in this case, a genetic disorder, which is a chondroplastic dwarfism. So essentially, this is when long bones of limbs stop growing in childhood. That's a bad thing because remember, in childhood, this is where we have a lot of bone growth happening. So if you stop bone growth, that essentially means you're going to be shorter. And so, but in this case, the torso, the bones of the torso and neck continue to grow. However, your limbs do not. So here's a picture. So you can see that his torso, which is your chest and your abdomen, continued to grow like normal. His neck continued to grow like normal, but his legs and his arms, not so much. Also, within long bones, we remember that this is where we have a lot of our growth. And if you're not able to calcify those bones well enough, it's going to be like gummy bears. And essentially, remember, your torso is balancing on top of your legs, so it causes weight to push on your legs, which is going to cause your legs to essentially bow out and actually kind of spread out. So if we look, let's look at a picture of bow legs. So bow legging will essentially cause your legs to kind of start expanding. Um, this is another picture here as well, where you see that the legs have essentially, the weight of the child has put so much weight on those legs that those legs have the bones have essentially, instead of being nice and straight, they essentially have started to warp and bend. And we don't want our legs to bend. So this is what happens with people who are bow-legged or essentially are lacking certain vitamins like vitamin D. So, stress or mechanical stress, we think of stress as being a bad thing, but it actually can be a good thing. So the thing is, our bones need stress. And by what I mean by stress is they need some type of mechanical weight or load. So if you are actively walking or running, going upstairs, you're putting stress on your bones, which is a good thing. And by you putting stress on them, essentially, it kind of breaks them just a hitch. But that's a good thing because it makes your osteoblasts start building them back up. So you want to have constant building of your bones. So just certain things like walking and going upstairs that put stress on your bones, and that's a good thing. We want to put stress on our bones. By putting stress on our bones, it makes osteoblasts work harder, and that's going to make them build more bones or build bones even stronger. And we want strong bones. We don't want soft bones. We want those bones to be nice and strong. So putting stress on those bones is a good thing. We want it to be built back stronger. So here's a interesting fact about how why men typically be is why men are typically taller than women. So now we've always heard women mature faster than men, but in this case, women hit their growth spurt first. They go through puberty first. And usually puberty is brought on in women by a burst of estrogen. Now, estrogen actually stimulates the bones and makes them work really fast. It makes them grow a lot faster. At the same time, estrogen is going to make those epiphyseal plates close faster, though. So it kind of works and kind of counteracts it. So it makes the bone grow faster, but also makes it stop growing faster. And because women hit puberty first, you're going to have your growth spurt quick, but it also stops you from growing quickly after. With men, we tend to hit puberty later, and testosterone is not as strong as estrogen, so we continue to grow. And so typically, we end up becoming taller than women because we start puberty later and we continue to grow. So testosterone allows us to grow just a tad bit longer than women. So on average, about women enter puberty 2 to 3 years earlier than men. So essentially, you have fewer years to actually grow, unfortunately. Now, there's a lot of hormones that are going to essentially help with bone growth or affect bone growth. So we have growth hormone, it does what it sounds. It stimulates proliferation at that plate, which is going to cause the bones to get longer. Our thyroid hormone, which is this gland that's right here at the base of our neck, that is going to cause osteoblasts to start working faster. Calcitonin is going to stop osteoclast activity. So osteoclast, remember, it's like the little Pac-Man. It stops them from breaking down our bone. And sometimes we want that to happen. Estrogen and testosterone is going to stimulate osteoblasts, which is going to cause it to build more bones. Parathyroid hormone is going to increase our blood calcium levels by causing osteoclasts to start working. So sometimes when our body is low on calcium and we need to get calcium out of our bones, we're going to tell the osteoclast to start eating our bones up a little bit, which is going to release that calcium into our bloodstream. Calcitriol, which is going to stimulate the uptake of calcium from our intestines, which is also one reason why we have to have vitamin D. Glucocorticoids is going to increase bone loss in children and impair bone growth. And then serotonin, which is like the hormone that our brain releases to make us happy, it can actually inhibit osteoprogenitor cells or osteoblasts. It can actually stop them from building bones. So when it comes to vitamin D, which I hope you understand which on this picture here, there's two places where it shows that we can get it. So we can get it from the sun. So if you go out in the sun for about 10 to 15 minutes a day, that is the amount of time that's required for you to get your daily dose of vitamin D. Or you can get it from milk. Now, vitamin D does not naturally occur in milk. Our government back in the 1930s actually started putting vitamin D in our milk, just like they started putting iodide in our salt. Iodide stopped us from our thyroid from making a goiter. Vitamin D, they started adding vitamin D to prevent us from getting rickets, which I think is probably a little bit lower than here. Rickets was essentially rickets is what's caused by vitamin D deficiency. So if you don't get enough vitamin D, your stomach cannot absorb the calcium. If you can't absorb calcium, you can't make your bones hard. If your bones can't get hard, that means that they're going to be soft, which means the weight from your body is going to start making your legs bow or stretch. and they're going to start, instead of your legs being nice and straight, they're going to start being curved. And we don't want that to happen. So that's why they started putting vitamin D in our milk. Um, so in this case here, the sun can turn the precursor molecule of 7-dehydrocholesterol, which hopefully you got the cholesterol part out of there. So essentially, it's going to take cholesterol and it's going to the sun is going to turn that into vitamin D3, which is also called cholecalciferol. That molecule is going to then go to the liver. That liver is going to add a OH group, which is called a hydroxide. And then the liver is going to put into the bloodstream and ship it to the kidney. And that kidney is going to now add another hydroxide. That's going to make it vitamin D. That's going to make it the active form of vitamin D. So we always said that you get vitamin D from the sun. Well, not necessarily. You get a derivative of vitamin D, but it has to go into the liver, into the kidney to become active vitamin D. Vitamin D then is going to go into your intestines and allow the intestines to absorb calcium. Once you're able to absorb calcium, you're able to send that calcium to your bones to make it harder. If you tend to stay inside a lot and not go out or not go outside or not drink milk or things that have vitamin D in them, you're going to be more prone to having rickets or bone softening. So that's why they always tell you it's good to go out and play. That's why they always encouraged us while we were in high school to drink milk with every meal, is so that we got our daily dose of vitamin D. And vitamin C actually helps with that as well. So also there's some other hormones like parathyroid hormones, which is on the back of this thyroid that we have in our neck. That hormone responds in response to reduced blood calcium levels. So if our calcium levels get too low, parathyroid hormone is going to tell our osteoclast to start breaking down our bones so that we can have some calcium in the bloodstream. The kidneys also, it also tells the kidneys to stop secreting, or it tells our kidneys to stop allowing calcium into our urine. So essentially, it's going to stop the kidneys from allowing urine to leave our body, because if we're low on calcium, we don't need the kidneys getting rid of our calcium. We need it to keep our calcium. So it tells our kidneys, hey, keep the calcium, don't let it go. And then the small intestine just tells it to increase absorption of calcium. So this is what that picture is showing you, just showing you how the parathyroid hormone is going to go into the bloodstream. It's going to act on the intestines to increase absorption. It's going to tell the kidneys to make more calcitriol, which is going to make our more active form of vitamin D. And it's also going to tell the kidney to not allow calcium to leave in the urine, to stay in the body. And it's also going to tell our bones or the osteoclast to start breaking down bones a little bit so that we have some more calcium. So rickets, again, is vitamin D deficiency. And so it's going to cause you to become bow-legged. How this actually came about was in the US or the Industrial Revolution, where people or children were in factories a lot. So they weren't outside and they were forced to work indoors. Well, indoors, you're not getting any sunlight. So with that being said, if you're not getting enough sunlight, you're not getting any vitamin D. They weren't drinking milk, so it was causing their bones to soften. And now you can see of how your bones were starting to bend. And we don't like that to happen. We want our bones to be nice and straight. Another one is calcitonin, which is released from the thyroid gland. Now, this is in response to high, high calcium levels. So parathyroid was in response to low calcium levels. But let's say now that our calcium levels are too high in the bloodstream, we now have to start getting rid of them. So we're going to start telling either the osteoblasts to start using that calcium to build our bones, and we're going to start telling our kidneys, get rid of this calcium. We got too much of it. So essentially, that's what's going to happen. Parathyroid is going to respond if we don't have enough calcium. Calcitonin is going to be responsive if we have too much calcium. So the effects of aging, which this is something we're constantly doing every single day. Um, so essentially, as we get older, bones are going to become thinner and weaker. Also, is a condition called osteopenia, which penia means poverty. So aging causes all people to become slightly osteopenic. Um, this is to begin from the ages of 35 or it can start in the age range of 35 to 40. So I have about 10 more years before I can get to 35. So I guess that's something to look forward to. Not really, but osteoblast activity declines. So remember, osteoblasts are building bones. So instead of having my bones start building at around 35, I'll have more osteoclasts breaking down than my osteoblasts are building up. And so this can be seen in different parts of the skeleton can be affected unequally. So like vertebrae, jaw bones, um, epiphyses, they tend to lose activity, which means, especially in the epiphyses of long bones, essentially there's more osteoclasts, which means it's breaking down bone more, which means that my bone tissue is going to start shrinking. And so essentially by the age of 35, 40, I could potentially go from 6'3" down to maybe 6 foot or 5'9". So, I mean, I can start decreasing in size as I get older. So in every decade, essentially, women lose roughly more of their not their muscle mass, well, actually, their muscle mass and their skeletal mass, really, than men. Because remember, y'all grow first, y'all have that growth spurt first, so y'all will actually start getting shorter first or before us. Um, so if you have a significant percentage of bone loss, it's going to be called osteoporosis, which is essentially poor. Porosis means poor. So essentially it becomes more, your bones start becoming a lot more porous, which means they start having a lot more holes. And so they essentially become weaker. So here it gives a little bit more information about essentially they become more porous, which means that they are also more likely to fracture or break. If you have, now this typically happens commonly in Caucasian or white women. Um, Also, if you have a smoking family history or a family history of osteoporosis, you're more likely to start having, or you might be more prone to osteoporosis. Um, and again, women start losing it before men does, and that's usually because you no longer produce estrogen or you're producing less estrogen, and so essentially the bones are not responding as well. So remember, estrogen made the bones grow faster and grow stronger. If you're not producing as much estrogen, you're not growing as fast and you're not growing as strong. Um, People who are having cancer treatments or chemotherapy, their bones become brittle because remember, your bones are constantly breaking or building and breaking down. Chemotherapy really is going to kind of cause cells to stop multiplying or proliferating, and your cells, especially like your hair cells, skin cells, the cells on the inside of your stomach that produces your mucus, and your bone cells are constantly always dividing. Chemotherapy stops that. So that's why people hair is going to fall out. That's why their stomach's going to have ulcers because that it's not producing that mucus lining that's going to protect it from the acid. Bones become more brittle because they're not able to build as fast. Um, so a way to see if this is happening in your body, if you're going through osteoporosis, is using a DEXA scan, which stands for Dual Energy X-ray Orbisotometry Scan. So you'll see a lot of these in the hospital done, especially with older people or people who are having chemo treatments. So it's going to provide an image to essentially assess whether your bones are aging properly or if they're losing mass at a proper rate. Um, so essentially, with medical treatments, it's going to essentially try to stop or slow the rate of bone loss. So it's going to try to slow osteoclast activity. Um, However, the side effect of these drugs, it can cause osteonecrosis, which necrosis means death. So it's going to have bone death. So it's going to really kind of target your lower mandible or your lower jaw. And you may have some other abnormalities in bone growth. So patients who usually are on these treatment plans can't be on there for more than 5 years at a time. And then fractures, which, especially if we're going to radiology, I always find this very interesting. So here are all the different types of fractures. And so over here we have comminuted, which essentially the bone is splintered into several different small pieces. And so you can see here, you got bones here, there, it's shattered here. They look like all these spiky pieces that are just split apart. Um, Here you have a Colles. This fractures of the distal end of the lateral forearm. So you see here that it's fractured, which fracture just means that there's a break. And so you can see that there's a small break here, but it's a nice even break. So it says it produces a dinner fork deformity. So it kind of looks like little tines of the fork. A compound, and this term compound open. So essentially, this is like a person who landed on their leg and it's kind of like snapped in half. So like essentially, you have the bone kind of like it hit each other almost, but it actually is essentially broken and it's actually sticking out the skin. That's why it's called open. But this is a pretty easy, a nice break because it's not in pieces. It's still pretty much whole. And then you have compression, which essentially is where there was too much pressure on them and they kind of crack or fracture. Green stick, green stick is due to, think about if you took a stick off a tree, a living tree, and then you broke it in half. However, with like green sticks, which is like trees that are living versus like a tree branch or a tree stick that is dead, those are very hard to kind of break in half because you can split the top of them, but the bottom half is going to be still attached, just like this right here. So think about if this was a stick off a fresh tree, it would break, the top portion would break, but the bottom portion wouldn't. So this is why it's called a green stick. Now, typically, if we find green sticks in infants or children, that's usually an indicator of child abuse, especially if we find it in their arms. Because remember, with children, their arms are made morely out of cartilage. So if they have a green stick fracture, they always usually are going to call Child Protective Services just because it's usually indicating that there was some type of abuse because you have to do a lot to that child's arm. That's like picking them up by their arm or shaking them. to cause a green stick fracture. And then we have some other ones that we kind of are used to. We have hairline, which is a very fine crack, ergo the name hairline. We have linear, which would be essentially along the axis of the bone. So, like in this case, it'd be going down the diaphysis. We have oblique. Oblique, if you remember from our planes, oblique is going into a diagonal or a slanted fashion. A pot fracture is at the distal ends of tibias and fibulas. And then here we have a transverse, which a transverse, again, is like the plane. Transverse means straight up and across, or it separates superior from inferior. We also have stress fractures, which are thin fractures due to repeated stressful impact. So like things like running, or if you're exercising, you can have what's called a stress fracture. And a spiral fracture, it spirals just like the spiral notebook has this little spiral that goes around. So you can have, so essentially it's like a twisting of a bone. So if I took this bone and twisted it somehow, they will cause a spiral type of fracture. So when it comes to bones healing, so if you broke a bone, the first thing the body's going to try to do is make a hematoma. So it's going to try to make essentially a bubble or try to seal off the bleeding and try to make the bone seated with each other. It's going to try to encapsulate what has happened or the trauma. So the hematoma, hema meaning blood, toma meaning like a tumor-ish or a clump of cells, essentially it's going to essentially try to stop the bleeding and plug it. In step two, that hematoma is going to turn into cartilage. And just like we saw earlier with cartilage, it's going to go through ossification and become hard and become hardened with calcium or hydroxyapatite. And then eventually we're going to start seeing that bone, because this bone is not straight anymore. It's still kind of got these bumps in it. Osteoclast is going to eventually start gnawing at it and start restructuring or remodeling the bone and get it back to normal. Now, typically it doesn't always go back to the way it was before. Just like in scar tissue, it's going to build it stronger than it was before. So typically, anytime someone has broken a bone, we can always see it in a X-ray after it's healed. So you could broke your humerus when you were a child, and now you could be 50 years old. We can still look at your X-ray now and tell that you broke this bone um, at a certain point in time in your life, because it's not going to build it back like it was before, but you'll have a little indication that this bone has been restructured or remodeled. So we have bone scans, which this is another method that we can test pathologies in the bone. So what's essentially is going to happen is that we're going to give you a radioactive isotope, which takes us back to chapter 2, I believe. Remember, isotopes are atoms or elements that have different numbers of neutrons, just like carbon-12 and carbon-14. So they're going to give you an isotope, which is going to be injected into you. And then they're going to use a certain type of machine or X-ray machine that's going to look at the differences in your bone densities. So essentially, you can have what's called a hot spot, which indicate that these areas have increased metabolism, or that there's a lot of bone tissue that's being built, or you had some type of fracture or cancer in this portion of the bone. But you can also have cold spots, which are going to indicate the opposite, which is less metabolism that's occurring, or that you're having some type of cell death or vascular death, or loss of blood supply in that portion of the bone. All right. So that wraps up chapter 7. Again, that's one of my favorite chapters, just talking about the bones. So the bones are not just bones, they have a lot of different things that are happening. So, again, we've learned that we need vitamin D, vitamin C, we are needing hydroxyapatite, we're needing chondrocytes and cartilage and fibroblasts. We're needing all these things for our bones. If our body is lacking in calcium or if it's lacking in phosphate, our bones are essentially storage units. And so we also have red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. And as we get older, our red bone marrow turns into yellow bone marrow, and that's going to turn into fat. So eventually, I guess that's something to look forward to, but not really, is that once we get older, our bones are going to turn into big bags of fat, if essentially. But I hope you learned something new. This is one of my favorite chapters, and I hope it's one of yours too. So until next time, we'll see you then.